Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, please kindly proceed to your seats. The program will start very shortly. Mesdames et messieurs, merci de bien vouloir rejoindre vos places. Nous allons commencer dans quelques instants. Thank you all for making your way kindly to your seats. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Thank you very much. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous prierai de bien vouloir regagner vos places à présent. Nous allons débuter dans quelques instants. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin. Please start making your way to your tables. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting very shortly. Mesdames et messieurs, la conférence va bientôt commencer. Merci de bien vouloir prendre place à vos tables respectives. Ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly ask you to make your way to your seats. We are about to begin. Mesdames et messieurs, merci de bien vouloir prendre place. Nous allons bientôt commencer le programme. Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, may I kindly ask you all to proceed to your tables. We'll be starting, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, le programme commence. And what a beautiful and powerful start to the Babacar Ndiaye Lecture 2025. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous invite à vous asseoir. Nous allons commencer, s'il vous plaît. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all proceed to our tables. We are already running late, and let's please make our way to our seats now. It's absolutely wonderful to see you all, ladies and gentlemen, but let's now proceed to our program. Et c'est un très beau coup d'envoi de la conférence Babacar Ndiaye 2000-2005. Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting now. Thank you very much to pay attention to the beginning of our program. We have a fantastic evening here, ready for you to enjoy. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous demanderai gentiment de prendre place. Nous avons toute une soirée exceptionnelle qui vous attend et nous avons déjà pris du retard. All right. Let's now proceed. Now starts the Babacar Ndiaye Lecture 2025. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like first to recognize those who honor us with their presence here tonight. So if I could have your attention, please, ladies and gentlemen. Mesdames et messieurs, it's lovely to see you connecting, but we really need to start now. There will be plenty of time to connect after our meal. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's all proceed now. I hope that you can hear me very clearly. Let's all proceed. Mesdames et messieurs, it's beautiful to see you all connecting here this evening. Beautiful smiles. You all look great, by the way. It's fantastic. Let's start. I would like to first recognize the presence here in this room of some of Africa's brightest minds. First, our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, esteemed panelists, honorable ministers, governors, and senior government officials here present, your excellencies, ambassadors, and members of the diplomatic corps, heads of international organizations and partner institutions, captains of industry, members of the board of directors of Afrexim Bank, senior executive vice president, and colleagues at Afrexim Bank, ladies and gentlemen of the press, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and I want to add daughters, sons, and friends of Africa. Be very, very welcome. And a special good evening to all those joining us live on Afrexim Bank TV. My name is Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges, and I'm absolutely delighted to be your guide through this exceptional evening here in beautiful Washington, D.C. And it's an evening of celebration of the vision and legacy brought to you by Afrexim Bank, the beating heart of the African trade and finance. Bonsoir, illustres invités, et soyez les bienvenus à la conférence Babacar Ndiaye de 2025, notamment à tous ceux qui nous suivent à présent en direct sur Afrexim Bank TV. Je m'appelle Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges et c'est un immense honneur de vous accompagner ce soir tout au long de cette soirée d'exception organisée par Afrexim Bank, le moteur du commerce et de la finance de notre beau continent. Every year, the Babacar Ndiaye lecture brings together Africa's greatest thinkers, builders, and partners, not only to reflect, but to act. And this year, we gather under a powerful and timely theme, leveraging global Africa's capital for development, the imperative for stronger African financial institutions amid geo-economic shifts. A theme that truly reminds us that the next revolution will be financial and that true independence begins with Africa trusting its own capital, its wealth, its knowledge, but above all, its people. Mesdames et messieurs, chaque année, la conférence Babacar Ndiaye réunit les esprits les plus visionnaires, les bâtisseurs et les partenaires de l'Afrique. Et non pas seulement pour réfléchir, mais également pour agir. Alors cette année, nous nous retrouvons ici sous un thème ambitieux mais essentiel, mobiliser le capital de l'Afrique pour le développement, la nécessité de renforcer les institutions financières africaines face aux mutations géo-économiques. Un thème qui nous rappelle que la prochaine révolution, elle sera financière. Et que c'est en ayant confiance en son propre capital, ses ressources, son savoir, ses populations, que l'Afrique pourra véritablement atteindre l'indépendance, comme nous la voulons. But before we begin, I just have a quick few notes to help us during this evening so that everything runs very smoothly. Please, I would ask you to keep your phones on silence. And tonight's ideas, I think, really deserves to travel beyond this room here. So be active online using our hashtag BNL2025. You would have noticed that you have headsets on your table because there'll be translation available throughout, and it's channel 1 for English, channel 2 for French. Should you have any issues with that, please raise your hand and a member of the team will be there to assist you. Behind me as well, you'll see a QR code. Please screen it and you will find the entire program of the evening there. There'll also be details to access our Wi-Fi. Last housekeeping note, please do keep those little gift vouchers that you were given when entering, because you'll need that at the end to have your goodie bag. Donc, avant de commencer, mesdames et messieurs, j'ai juste quelques petites infos pratiques. Merci de bien vouloir mettre vos téléphones en mode silencieux, s'il vous plaît. Alors, j'aime à dire que les idées qui vont être partagées ici méritent vraiment d'aller au-delà de cette salle. Alors, soyez actifs en ligne en utilisant notre hashtag BNL 2025. Enfin, vous verrez des casques sur vos tables. C'est pour la traduction simultanée, le 1 pour l'anglais, le 2 pour le français. Si vous avez besoin d'aide, vous n'avez qu'à lever la main et un membre de l'équipe sera là pour vous aider. Enfin, derrière moi, il y a un code QR avec tout le programme qui sera disponible en scannant ce code. Il y a également comment accéder au Wi-Fi. Et enfin, petite dernière annonce, gardez bien les petits bons cadeaux parce que vous en aurez besoin à la fin du programme pour récupérer vos cadeaux. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly invite you all to rise for the Afreximbank anthem, please. Mesdames et messieurs, levez-vous, s'il vous plaît, pour l'hymne d'Afreximbank.
The shores of the motherland and far beyond, with dignity we rise and we build a bridge for all, with integrity, respect, trust, excellence, commitment, creativity. We will build for Africa's prosperity. We will build for the now and posterity. As we standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa's trade. Oh, we are
We may all sit down, please. Merci de bien vouloir vous asseoir. And now, to formally open this evening, we turn to one of Afreximbank's guiding forces, a leader whose wisdom, professionalism, and dedication continue to shape the bank's mission of empowering Africa's transformation through resilience and vision. Let's all now welcome Dr. George Elombi, Executive Vice President for Governance, Legal and Corporate Services, and President-designate of Afreximbank.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thanks for keeping the wall warm for us at this very start of the evening. And thank you, guests, for coming to this Babacar and Ndiaye lecture. Distinguished invitees, welcome to the 9th edition of the Afreximbank Babacar and Ndiaye annual lecture. We have often held the lectures on the sidelines of these IMF World Bank annual meetings. Each year we gather to pay tribute to a visionary leader. Dr. Ndiaye. He served as the 5th president of the African Development Bank from about 1985 to 95. We reflect on the evolving context of Africa's development. We take the opportunity to renew our shared commitment to advancing this cause of development which he so passionately championed. This lecture, therefore, is a renewal of faith in the vision of Babacar Ndiaye. As in the past, this renewal of faith also dictates that we invite a speaker and panelists of faith to lead, to shape and deepen the discussion. This year, Dr. Babacar has agreed to discharge that responsibility. He sits right in front here, in the center of the hall. He's a former president of the African Development Bank, who led a transformative decade in that institution, tripling the ADB's capital base to over 100 billion, and enabled an unprecedented scale of investment in Africa's infrastructure and in its human capital. He was a very skillful operator, good at managing issues and at managing problems. We know that particularly well at the Afrexim Bank, where his relationship started much longer than when he took office at the ADB. In fact, he was one of those at the very start of the creation of Afrexim Bank in 1993, for in the mid-90s, he was already Deputy Minister of Finance of Rwanda. Dr. Babacar, thank you for accepting to discharge this responsibility. We are aware that you're doing this in honor of one of your predecessors, but also for the very, very cause which you have championed for too long. To enrich the discussions, we also invited Professor Lisa Sachs. She's somewhere right here in the building, on that side. We are honored to welcome you, Professor Sachs. You are an influential voice in the global movement for responsible development. We are aware that you operate at the convergence of international investment, of human rights, and sustainability, where your leadership continues to shape global standards for, amongst others, inclusive prosperity. We thank you for accepting to enrich the discussions this evening. We also invited Professor Kaku Nabuko, whom many of you would know already from his very open discussions and open positions. He's over there. On African financial sovereignty. We are privileged to have you with us, Professor Nabuko. You are a distinguished economist and Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management at the University of Lomé. Your thought leadership continues to influence economic discourse across West Africa, Central Africa, and beyond. Dr. Mishak Mutezi, who also sits on that side, on the far side of the hall, we are pleased to welcome you to this event. Sometimes it's incredible to believe how one man can take a fight and fight the entire rating agency world with quite significant success. We are therefore pleased to welcome Dr. Mutezi, an expert in credit ratings at the African Peer Review Mechanism, whose work stands at the forefront of Africa's evolving financial landscape. Thank you, Dr. Mutezi, for your expertise in sovereign risk assessment and credit rating reforms, and for being instrumental in advancing research and conventional rating, and the challenges you've made to conventional rating methodologies, and for advocating frameworks and accurately capturing the potential of Africa's economies. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, well, Dr. Ndiaye was a man whose vision turned words into action. He believed that Africa's progress depended on creating strong institutions built by Africans, financed by Africans, resourced as a whole by Africans, and led by Africans. He was not content with dependence, but believed in designing mechanisms of self-reliance. He understood that true independence meant having the capacity to stand out on our own and to shape our own future, no matter how the world around us changes. Driven by this conviction, Dr. Ndiaye devoted his life to designing mechanisms of self-reliance and structures that would empower Africa to stand firm in a changing world. And through that leadership, institutions such as the Afrexim Bank emerged. He didn't stop with the Afrexim Bank. Shelter Afrique and the African Business Roundtable came into being through his effort. Each of those institutions was born out of a belief that Africans must be the architects of their own economic destiny. These institutions remain living testaments to his principle that vision, when combined with action, builds legacies that outlast generations. His legacy is therefore not one of dreams or promises, but Dr. Ndiaye's real legacy was in action and building lasting systems. There was need for Africa to control its own destiny and development. Dr. Ndiaye believed in it, and he acted. Among these institutions, the establishment of Afrexim Bank was his most enduring achievement. We say so not out of any deduction. We say so because we heard him say it in his own voice, not once, not twice, numerous times over, at lectures of this nature and at the Afrexim Bank AGMs. Under Dr. Ndiaye's guidance, the bank was designed not as a mere replica of existing financial institutions, but as a Pan-African multilateral engine, uniquely structured to meet Africa's economic and development needs. Its hybrid design, a blend of public mandate with private sector dynamism, enabled Afrexim Bank to innovate continuously, developing bespoke financial solutions and instruments and risk mitigation tools that responded to Africa's realities. He also made sure that the mandate of the bank was defined in such a way that enabled the banks to intervene in circumstances where today others describe ignorantly, without reading the mandate of the bank, as mission creep. There is no mission creep. Development has no creep. It just has to be done, whatever the area, whatever the sector. The governance model of the institution is rooted in African ownership, yet inclusive of global partners. That combination of an African public sector, the African private sector, international private sector, international public sector. That very unique partnership is what today is being used to undermine, or as an attempt to undermine the institution itself, even at a time when the mantra is public-private partnerships. The institution was Babacar Ndiaye's idea of public-private partnerships. Our theme this year, therefore, is leveraging global Africa's capital for development, the imperative of stronger African financial institutions amid geoeconomic shifts. This theme captures that very necessity of having institutions which were strong to push the African agenda. It is not merely aspirational, it is a call to action. It reminds us that Africa's future also depends on building institutions that reflect our values and serve our priorities and stand with us when the world is uncertain. But those institutions and what drives them must first belong to us. And Babacar Ndiaye's idea of what Afreximbank should be was that it would be an institution owned by Africans, largely controlled by Africans, working on the agenda set by Africans. That has been quite worrying to many quarters. But that very ambition now, Dr. Kaberuka, is not something we're going to abandon so soon. The promise to you and to people like Babacar Ndiaye, who reflected your view of African development, is that that agenda must continue until the task of development is significantly achieved. In the past, the viability of African institutions was an issue. Questions arose because quite often those institutions failed or were seen as failing. They have become more relevant, extremely relevant. The institutions have grown stronger. They have perhaps become a threat. Their existence is in question again. This time, not because the institutions are failing, but because we succeed. At the heart of this is whether our success is not disrupting others. But the conversation is disguised and is framed quite misleadingly on such non-issues as, for example, whether we are a preferred creditor, whether we have a preferred creditor status. We do not believe that that discussion is the essence of it. The real essence of it has to do with the credibility, the relevance of our institutions. And we probably have become too relevant. And so that very principle of our credibility, which undermines our effectiveness, is now being put into question. Not because we failed to deliver, because others see us as disruptive. The preferred creditor status has worked for Afreximbank in practice. In fact, for us, it's been a treatment. It's not a status. It's enshrined in our charter in ways that it might not have been in the charter of institutions which were created earlier than Afreximbank. But it's very clear for us. You cannot set a moratorium of our debts. Certain things the states can do under the charter, and if a better treatment under the agreement establishing Afreximbank, if a better treatment was given to another financial institution, that treatment, in terms of the agreement establishing Afreximbank, should also be applied to Afreximbank. So those who claim to have it, they do so, and we also claim to have it because we also do so. Those who feel adversely affected, the disrupted, and now, as far as we are concerned, the disruptors, they are all now good economists. They now ask, If it's worked in practice, it shouldn't work in theory. It's worked in practice because the Afrexim Bank actually does get the treatment from its member states. And now they say, in theory, we do not have it. That's a clever economist. When it's worked in practice, then he asks, but in economic theory, it cannot work. But for us, it's actually worked. It's worked in practice, and it has allowed institutions like Afrexim Bank to lend confidently, extremely confidently, during times of crisis, to build capital buffers and to mobilize investors with assurance that their commitments are protected. However, when PCIs is used to undermine and consistently applied to refuse African institutions access to capital, this is destabilizing. It threatens our existence. And so, let's be clear about that. For us, our defense of Afrexim Bank's preferred creditor treatment, and this doesn't only apply to Afrexim Bank, it applies to those other institutions which, like us, when created later on, we extended similar privileges to that in the Afrexim Bank's charter, the African Finance Corporation, Shelter Afrique, African Reinsurance Corporation, for all those African institutions in a similar situation. For us, the PCS, the preferred creditor status, and the treatment we receive is not a privilege. It's not a privilege. It is about preserving our financial sovereignty, something essential to our continent's ability to finance its own development, something the likes of Professor Kaku Nabuko have spent the last 15 years talking about, arguing, trying to educate our populations on. In this regard, Afrexim Bank's track record speaks for itself. It's very glaring. That institution has disbursed over $155 billion in the past decade, in 10 years, including $18.7 billion in 2024 alone. We're trying to count hand by hand. But we cannot find those other institutions which think we should be given a lesser treatment by our own states. We're trying to see which of them has disbursed $18 billion in 1 year in the African continent. Distinguished invitees, these figures, they are not just numbers, they are not just entries on an institution's balance sheet. They represent lives and livelihoods. They represent jobs, trade, and hope. They stand as living proof of what Africa can accomplish when trust is matched by capacity and when vision is reinforced by action. And Africans have proven themselves reliable partners in this enterprise, despite the persistent and unfair characterization of the continent as a high-risk environment. The fact that Afrexim Bank could invest $155 billion over time, just 10 years, in Africa, on a balance sheet of less than 35 billion or 40 billion as it is right now, cumulatively over a certain period, but 155 billion disbursed over 10 years, suggesting that you had periods when that balance sheet was just 15 billion and 25 billion. And while we did so and recorded consistent and improving returns each year, year on year, the fact that that could happen is proof. It speaks to the trust, to the creditworthiness of African borrowers. We are not very risky. We are actually credit rated. That's proof that African borrowers, undeniably, it's empirical proof that Africans honor their obligations and that Africa is not merely bankable, it is dependable it is not too risky. The real challenge to us, therefore, is not risk. It is perception, the way we are seen, the way people look at us. That perception is the work that we have been on. That perception, as you know, Dr. Kabaruka, is the work you started with Dr. Rama when you were a young researcher at the African Research Consortium. It's a work you've been on for a long time. That perception is the work some of us have heard Professor Nabuko outline, speech after speech, podcast after podcast, conference after conference in Togo, in Yaoundé, in Cotonou, in Abidjan, across West Africa, and across Central Africa. Perhaps today and thereafter, we should be able to put together a team of like-minded Africans and those outside Africa, like Professor Sachs and Professor Lisa Sachs. They're different persons, I assume, but, but as the fruit never falls too far from the tree, we have assumed Professor Lisa Sachs is the same as Professor Sachs. Those who believe in our causes and would work with us to achieve our objectives. Correcting this false perception is not simply a matter of fairness. It is essential to addressing our access to capital on fair terms. It's a key to empowering the continent to finance its own development, strengthen its sovereignty, and realize its immense potential. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, as we look ahead, we think three principles must remain unnegotiable. First, we must reaffirm the credibility and performance of African financial institutions. Their success stories must be told, documented, and defended. Second, we must protect our treatment, our very special treatment by our own member states who created us as the bedrock of Africa's financial independence, and insist on the faithful enforcement of its rule, voluntarily, willingly, by those same states that established these institutions and embedded the treatment into the treaties. Without it, we risk sending a message that rules and laws have no force or meaning inside Africa, that when it comes to us, as we are accused of frequently, of failing in the rule of law, but that after we execute treaties in our own interest, we sit back and violate the treaties, article after article, provision after provision. Third, we must accelerate the completion of Africa's financial architecture, ensuring that the African Monetary Fund, the African Investment Bank, the African Central Bank become full operational pillars of our sovereignty. Let this year's Babacar Ndiaye lecture serve as a catalyst for action in those directions. His legacy was not through words alone, but through commitment to the financial sovereignty which we now so praise for. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening.
Thank you once again, Dr. Elombi, President-designate of Afreximbank. Thank you for such inspiring opening words. A powerful reminder, in fact, of Afreximbank's unwavering commitment to driving Africa's transformation through unity and vision. And as we celebrate that vision, let us pause now to honor the man whose dream continues to guide this journey. A pioneer, a believer in African excellence, and a visionary behind the very institution that brings us together tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me now in paying tribute to Dr. Babacar Ndiaye.
Today, we celebrate a Pan-African visionary leader who lived decades ahead of his time. The late Dr. Babacar Ndiaye, the former president of the African Development Bank. As a trailblazing architect of a new era, he dreamt of an African future controlled by Africans and African institutions. He dreamt of an institution that will lead the continent to its promised land, a Pan-African trade finance bank. A remarkable institutionalist who at first, as president of the African Development Bank, AFDB, in 1985, envisioned among many institutions a Pan-African trade bank to deal with the challenges of the time and championed the course of Africa's trade and economic development in the years ahead. At a time when Afro-pessimism, financial turmoil and constrained trade landscapes dominated the 1980s, skepticism surrounded the idea of a dedicated trade finance bank for Africa. But Babacar Ndiaye remained steadfast in his belief. In his reflections, the first president of Afreximbank, Mr. Christopher Edordu, said of this avowed institutionalist, his tenacity, courage and persistence made him pursue the idea of an Afreximbank without wavering. Some told him they would not support the idea of an Afreximbank. Others told him, after Afreximbank was set up, that it was a mistake. And his successor, Mr. Jean-Louis Ekra, remarked that Dr. Ndiaye not only conceived the Afreximbank project, but pursued it tenaciously, against all odds, to make the project a reality. The exemplary vision he exhibited in conceptualizing the project was only matched by the zeal and doggedness with which he ensured that the vision of a Pan-African trade finance institution became a reality. On his part, Professor Benedict Orama, the third and current president of Afreximbank, said, Babacar Ndiaye was an epitome of today's African financial landscape. He probably pioneered the first serious step towards addressing the fundamental problems facing Africa. Perhaps the most transformative step taken by an African since the establishment of the African Development Bank in 1960. Dr. Babacar Ndiaye's passion for Afreximbank never waned on establishment. A decade later, he said, considering the difficult operating environment during the last decade, I feel satisfied that the bank is solidly on the road towards a full realization of our dreams. From his sweat, sacrifice and selflessness, Africa today can boast of an institution it owned and controlled that has become the cornerstone for the delivery of Africa's economic agenda. The African Continental Free Trade Area is taking shape. Thanks to this child of necessity, industrial edifices are expanding across Africa, thanks to this bank. And Africa can now look inward to its institution to manage the impact of global crises. The hope of economic emancipation is becoming real. From Afreximbank to the African Business Roundtable, and from Africa Reinsurance Corporation to Shelter Afrique, Dr. Babacar Ndiaye left indelible institutional footprints that are today helping to shape Africa's development trajectory.
And in honor of Dr. Babacar Ndiaye and the presence of his family here in the room, I'm going to say in Wolof, Jërëjëf and Yofar. Every edition of the lecture has one clear goal, which is to make us think, question, and act differently. This year's theme reminds us that building stronger African financial institutions is not only an economic necessity, but it is a strategic act of sovereignty. To mobilize Africa's capital is to finance its freedom. And to lead us through this reflection, we are absolutely honored to welcome now a man whose leadership has shaped the financial structure and architecture of our continent. Let's put our hands now to welcome Dr. Donald Kaberuka, Chairman and Managing Partner of Southbridge and former President of the African Development Bank.
Thanks, George. Thank you. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be invited to deliver the annual lecture. But I know I stand between you and dinner, and there's a panel after me, and it has been a long day for many of you. So I'm going to try and speak within the time allocated to me, which is 30 minutes. I hope that is okay. But I want to thank the Afrexim Bank and the leadership for this opportunity. Dr. Orama and you, George. And I also want to congratulate the team from the bank who have made this possible. And to say thank you to the family of Babacar for being present with us today. You know, I'm following the footsteps of previous speakers to honor President Ndiaye, who was, as you heard, truly a pioneer in building African institutions, beginning with Shelter Afrique in 1982, and then Afrexim Bank 10 years later. Those of us who came in followed his example. In my case, when I was in the bank, I tried to follow the example of Babacar, and we put in place a few more institutions to try to fill the gaps. Africa 50 Infra, Africa Guarantee Fund, and the lack of it. But Babacar was also keen to see even institutions which are not set up by the African Development Bank prosper. The lack of the Trade and Development Bank, BOAD, and many others. Now, the case for strong African financial institutions is well established. But that has not always been the case. For an anecdote, by the way, you can read in some publications, when the African Development Bank was being established in 1964, a delegation came to see the then president of the World Bank, led by a Liberian gentleman who was responsible for putting together the bank. And he says in his book, then the question to him was, but why does Africa need an African Development Bank? We already have the World Bank. That was the response. Much more recently, I don't know how to use this machine, but I'll try. I will need help here. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Much more recently, as the African School of Governance was being initiated, one had similar sentiments. Oh, there are so many schools of governance across Africa. There are so many fantastic schools of governance across the world. So why does Africa need a school of governance? But thanks to the tenacity of the founders, the school is now up and running in Kigali, training Africa's future diplomats, future political actors, future corporate leaders. And so this skepticism about African institutions, George, is not new. The founders always understood the importance of African agency in projecting Africa's ambitions and amplifying Africa's voice globally. Successful nations across the world have always nurtured strong homegrown institutions. I can think of the Brazilian National Development Bank, China Development Bank, and a large number of high-performing trade banks across the world. Last year, you invited the former Nigerian Vice President, Osibanjo, where he was very eloquent and spoke about climate and poverty. Today, you have asked me and the distinguished panel to talk about the imperative of strong African financial institutions at this juncture of our development journey. So today, I would like to accomplish the following three things. Why now? What are those geopolitical shifts? And I will be suggesting that there are 5 features which, in my view, are not temporary blips, but permanent features of the new landscape. 1, mercantilism is back, unhindered. Number 2, the re-emergence of narrow national interests. Number 3, the end of a 6-year era of aid. Number 4, weakened global institutions and multilateralism. Now, the issue is, but how do we actually bring about such institutions? Before I do so, let me make a few general remarks. With the help of technology, I don't know if this has been resolved. No? So that is the School of Governance in Kigali. It was being inaugurated about 2 weeks ago, I think. I still have challenges with this machine. If someone can help. So that was being inaugurated last week. Again, same skepticism as what the school would have. We now have the first cohort of students from across Africa, made a mid-career, people from the corporate world, diplomatic world, and the start is very, very encouraging. I'll be suggesting something else tonight, that the difference between Africa, China, and India are straightforward. Now, Africa is 1.4 billion people, almost. China is 1.4 billion people. India, 1.4 billion people. But China is 30% the size of Africa. India is 10% of the size of Africa, but 1.4 billion people. The difference is China is one country, India is one country, we are 54 countries. That is the only difference. And because of that difference, it means institutions that bring us together, that make us overcome these barriers and fragmentation, are extremely important and they are existential. I'll come back to this. The second point I'll be making is this one. Take a look carefully. This is from the World Bank. In 1990, the face of poverty was the red part, mainly Asia. African countries had still large numbers of poor people. That is the blue part. But look at what has happened in Asia, the red part. The number of poor people living in poverty has diminished to almost insignificance. But the blue part, which is Africa, although we're still a small size, the number of poor people has actually gone up because of demographics. I will come to this presentation. But the third thing I want to come to is one which George mentioned. Take a look at this. I've mentioned this once at one of your conferences in Accra, I think. This is the view of Africa, but it's an external view. It is not our view of ourselves. So this famous publication in 2000 described Africa as what? A hopeless continent. Hopeless continent. 2000. I was finance minister at the time, it's recently. The reason for this was that there was a terrible war going on in Liberia and Sierra Leone. The AIDS pandemic was at its height. The debt issues and so on. And so, because this was an external view, it was not only challenging us, but it was one condemning us to hopelessness. That was 2000. But look at the same publication 2011. You remember that phrase, Africa Rising? The same publication. In 10 years, we have gone from hopeless Africa to Africa Rising. Again, another view from outside. There are positive happening in Africa at the time. Real per capita growth in economics was up for the first time. But Africa Rising is a phrase which I personally challenged at the time, because I think it had two sides of the same coin, which I'll come to later. Now, notice the same publication in 2013. 2 years later, now it is Aspiring Africa. All right? And in 2019, now it is the Scramble for Africa. This is a problem of perception, which we have to deal with, and which is sometimes reinforced. And again, African institutions to challenge these narratives are extremely important. But you can even look at this. This was the same publication. I read it very often, this is why I could cite many others. This one really distressed me quite a lot, to the extent I wrote to the editors. Really, was Africa the place of death, debts, and democratic doubts? But you were saying a few years before that Africa was rising. Africa was aspiring. This was because of COVID. But this is how they described us. So imagine if you're in the rating agencies, you are a book runner for some banks, and you read this, what do you make of it? I will also be coming to this, by the way. Because at the time of COVID, I heard things like, Africa will be the continent to suffer the most. They always say that. I can tell you now, with all the candor at my command, because the lack of Vera and I were working on these issues at the time, looking for vaccines, I could not see why that would happen. Yes, our health systems were poor, but our concern was more getting equity on vaccines, deploying those vaccines, and preventing economic damage to our countries. I'll come back to this. Now, I put this up here to show you that as soon as COVID began to subside, tourism recovered. Actually now, we're almost at the pre-COVID numbers. In my own country, we lost a number of jobs during COVID, but we now have created more jobs after COVID than existed before COVID. But who cares to tell this story if we don't? And it's only us and our institutions to tell this story. Now, I'll come to this later, which there are know very well. We have also gone through phases where the challenge to our continent is described in different ways. There were times in the 70s when the mantra was, it is a resource gap. All Africa needs is more resources, more money. And so the aid industry was born. That's how the aid industry was born. By early 1980s, don't worry about my age, I was doing my master's degree at the time. There's a famous publication from the World Bank. I don't know if it is still available. It was called Accelerated Development in Africa by one Professor Elliot Begg. And it said, no. Africa's challenge is not resources, it is policy. They have the wrong policies. I will come to that. It is true, there were challenges of policies. But the problem was, but who will define those policies? I will come to that. Not long after that, they said, no, it is no longer policies. Africa's problem is capacity, execution. It's true, there are capacity execution issues, all right? But are they only problems in Africa? And was that surprising that young nations have capacity issues? Not long after that, I was then already, I believe, in government. They said, no, it's not capacity, it is governance. And later it is institutions. The truth of the matter is, all these things were challenges, whether it is money, policies, governance, capacity, institutions. But when these are defined from outside, an external view, they become less than useful. But if these are defined internally by our own institutions, that is something different. There's another case for having institutions that define our policies, define our institutions, exactly to fill all those gaps. I'll come back to it. Now, I'll skip this for a moment. I'll skip that moment too. I want to show this. I want to come back to it. People who are in the development field should look at this thing carefully. I hear often about how we have a demographic dividend about to come. So investing in jobs and all this, that is true. But take a look at this map. All it says is that as the rest of the world is aging, which is true, Africa is still at fertility rates above 4.2%. But remember, fertility rates in Africa were 8 in the 1950s. The only point I'm making here, which I'm going to come to, is that fertility rates are actually coming down faster than we think. Just look at a country like Kenya. It's no longer dark blue. It is light blue because fertility rates are declining. Look at the rest of Southern Africa. Look at Northern Africa. And I'll be saying that what this means are two things. Number one, the demographic dividend, the famous demographic dividends, will be maybe shorter than we think. Traditionally, 30 to 50 years. Ours might be shorter, but it also means if we are to invest in education, in human capital, things which make us benefit from the dividend, the investment is now. Again, the importance of institutions. I'll come back to it. But I want to spend some time on this. Because, George, you well described how we need African financial institutions. I'll come to this in a moment. But actually, a bit like an orchestra, African financial institutions on their own will not get to the end point. It has to be part of an ecosystem of African financial institutions, not simply financial institutions. They have to operate together in symphony. And this is why I really want to commend Benedict Orama and you, George, and the team of the bank, because you are one of the institutions which have understood this. Because I know you support the continental free trade area. I don't know if you support the African peace and security architecture. Thank you. I think you supported very much the Center for Disease Control, Vera. Yes? And you support the regional economic communities and other specialized institutions. It's important. We can spend some time here on how we bring about excellent financial institutions. But if they're not part of this architecture, if they're not part of this architecture, they will underperform. So I'll make the point that we need African institutions, financial, in the peace and security architecture, in pandemic management, regional communities, and the rest of it. This is what I call system coherence. We need African institutions in Africa which are like an orchestra. Each one of them is excellent. But if they work together, then we have music. I'll come to this point. But anyway, since I've been given 30 minutes and I'm watching the... let me make a couple more points and I'll try to end on time. So, the fact that Africa, even though still dependent on external capital, still sits on a lot of resources among institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, that could be more effectively deployed for a comfortable return is well known. The total I've been told that is in excess of 1.1 trillion. I've seen larger numbers. I think it depends how they are calculated. At one of the annual meetings, I think we went through these calculus. In the same spirit, we're well aware how huge surpluses are accumulating in markets with aging populations, instead of being deployed in youthful nations, not for development, but for attractive returns. Yesterday, Makta Diop, head of the IFC, in the Financial Times, articulated this problem very well. He called it a systemic risk. I asked you to look up that article by Makta. And he called for a new model for emerging market funding. He was referring to the 400 trillion managed by institutional investors, only a fraction of which ends up in the global south, less than 10%. Now, this problem has eluded many initiatives for many reasons: perceived risk, currencies, governance, misaligned objectives, etc. I think I concur with Makta that we need a new model that to unlock that possibility based on the DFIs. But it can't be the DFIs alone. It has to be the DFIs and Africa's own institutions. So this is my second problem, why it's not simply mobilizing African capital. It is mobilizing African capital, but also intermediating with the capital from aging societies. It can't be done simply from outside the continent. We have to be part of it. Now, I will not go through the element of perception. George described it, and you saw what they are saying about it. And over time, I think institutions have been created to try and deal with, some of which you mentioned, George, which Babacar created. And I think these institutions do a great job, whether it is trade and project finance, insurance, reinsurance, infrastructure, housing, guarantee funds. I think the challenge now, which I think in the AMFI you are trying to address, is how to federate these institutions and bring about system coherence, each in their own mandate, but system coherence in an ecosystem. And I want to salute here the role played by Afreximbank truly over the years, particularly during the COVID crisis. I think two institutions played a major role. That was Afreximbank and Africa Center for Disease Control. But I want also to say this. As we think about Africa's institutions, it's not simply about money. Remember the evolution of development I just mentioned? Resource gap, policy gap, governance, capacity. It has also to be able to generate appropriate policies, influence global issues, all right? And anchor Africa's integration via the CFTA. It simply can't be mobilizing money. It has to be mobilizing money, deploying capital, but also generating policies which work for us. So when the Organization of African Unity was created, it immediately decided to bring about the African Development Bank. Now, George, remember this. When in the 1970s, a decision was made to expand the financial power of the bank. It was decided that, okay, there were issues in terms of capacity of the bank to borrow in the capital markets. So the capital of the FDB was open to non-African countries to the tune of 30%. That decision was not uncontroversial. It even led to the then president being unbelievably relieved of office. Babacar Ndiaye's predecessor, a gentleman from Ghana. Now, subsequently, it required astute husbandry in its governance structures in terms of things like the double majorities, location of the headquarters, the presidency, etc., to preserve what those who are skeptical called the potential loss of African character. Now, when the African Union was born at the turn of the millennium, the Constitutive Acts mandated the creation of three institutions. George mentioned them. The African Central Bank, to build towards a single currency, the African Monetary Fund, African Investment Bank, and even a Pan-African Stock Exchange. A few more have from time to time been proposed. I want to say, however, that it is very necessary that adequate care and attention and rigorous preparation are done to maximize chance of success and avoid the risk of underfilled aspirations. Either way, the current geopolitics leaves Africa with little option. We, of course, need strong global cooperation. The reality, however, is that the world is different now. Mercantilism is back in full force. Previously, it would have been dressed up in some form of free trade and global values. Not anymore. National interests now increasingly dominate the global view. This has always been the case, but is now much more explicit and emphatic. Global institutions like WHO, WTO, that smaller countries have always relied on, are now losing influence and resources and are being disregarded altogether as the world moves to multipolarity and fragmentation. Indeed, in the current publication of Foreign Affairs, I think I had it here. I hope I can, my skills have improved since then. Let me see. Yeah, I show this one. Look it up, this publication. There are two articles in there which are very interesting. One is by Mike Froman, who was President Obama's Trade Secretary. Another one is by Wally Adeyemo, who was number 2 at the Treasury until recently. And in the case of Mike, the first sentence he makes is that the global trade system as we have known it, the global trade system as we have known it is dead. Look up this publication and you find. So let me just try to summarize. I want to say also that I've heard sometimes people glorifying the period between 1945 and now, how great it was. And now we're ending to fragmentation. I stand in the midway between glorification and vilification. I think there lies a more pragmatic interpretation. Institutions that were set up in 1945, for which we have relied upon, were not meant to resolve our problems. They were meant to deal with effects of the crisis of the 1930s, the currency wars, the tariff wars, and of course, the real wars. Either the World Bank is, for low-income countries was only created in 1960. Before that, the World Bank, real name, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was about reconstruction of Europe and Japan. It was not about low-income countries. By 1960, IDA was created, and we're always grateful for that. Now, I also want to say that that same system, across the years, each time it has not served the interest of wealthy countries, it has been bypassed, or informal arrangements have been created. You remember, many of you are still very young when I look at your faces. So let me tell you a story here, just to make sure. In 1972, there was a major crisis in the currency markets, which then also ended up being a crisis in the oil markets. You remember when oil went from $2 to $30? Okay. The reason was that the way the currency system has evolved, we have gone from a currency backed by gold to a currency backed by gold and the dollar. Now, from 1972, that connection was broken. President Nixon devalued the dollar and abolished the fixed exchange rate overnight. Now, that created havoc in the currency markets and led to the oil crisis. I'm saying this because this is what led to the creation of the G7, G8, or G7 plus 1, all right? Because the existing institutions could not deal with this problem. So an informal arrangements had to be found. But that informal arrangements did not involve us, African countries. I can go forward to 2008, at least many of you were there at the time, I hope. Another informal arrangement was made, the G20. At least South Africa was there for the first time. Now the African Union is present. In fact, South Africa is hosting the G20 next month. But it was another informal arrangement because existing institutions were not working for the world. Now, look also what happened during that, I like to call it a near-death experience in 2008. What did the wealthy countries do? They decided to do whatever it takes, to use Mario Draghi's famous phrase. They rolled out massive stimuluses equal to 2% of global GDP. They cut interest rate to zero, even to negative. When that was not enough, they rolled out quantitative easing, i.e. printing money and buy debt. That's what it means in human language. But it was called quantitative easing. So they had institutions to do so. They had institutions to do so, all right? I recall at the time, looking at the absence of African institutions to handle this, I called a meeting of finance ministers and governors of the central bank at the headquarters of the bank to ask, how are we doing? How are our banks doing? How can we manage, all right? And together with the ECA and the African Union, we agreed on some mechanisms which minimize the damage. So let me finally really conclude. Moments of peril, as they say, should not be wasted. It is time for African financial institutions to come together in a coherent continental system with other institutions. You have already made the bold decision to create AMFI. I think Babacar and Ndiaye would have been very proud of you for that. But we need institutions that are long-lasting, that can use their collective balance sheet effectively, each within their own mandate. Again, as I said, I've improved on my, no, I haven't. This one. This is what we need. If Afreximbank is very good on its own, that is not enough. It has to be good. So is Shared Africa, so is TDI, so is TDB, so is the African Union. If you work together like an orchestra, that is what will work. And therefore, I want you to think in terms of an ecosystem, in terms of system coherency. This will serve Africa. I want to salute the new president of the FDB, CD, who has called for what he calls a continental financial architecture alongside a global financial architecture, side by side, which will bring all these institutions together. Afreximbank, AFC, Africa 50, Shared Africa, and many other regional institutions. However, I totally agree with your new president. This will happen only if the owners of these institutions provide meaningful support and demonstrate absolute ownership by providing the means and the political support needed at all times. By the way, this may include examining some of the regulations that impede them in mobilizing Africa's capital. Some, George mentioned, but I also want to add insurance regulations or pension regulations which impede beyond the border investment. Now, when Babacar and Ndiaye set up Shared Africa, welcome, head of Shared Africa and Afreximbank, Africa was facing a moment of peril. Afro-pessimism, they called it. They called it the lost decade. But those institutions have stood the test of time. Now, we are at a similar point today because of the geopolitics. Now, we need these institutions not simply to step up, but to move to the next level. Go to the next level in a system which is coherence. At the end of the day, the aim is economic transformation, decent jobs for our people, and Africa's full economic sovereignty, ending the aid and debt cycle, participating in global trade and investment at higher global value chains. Now, don't be surprised that for everyone who thinks African institutions are doing too little, there are those who fear that they are doing too much, that they are too small, they're overstretched, they take too much risk, and that they should limit themselves both in space and scope. We should absolutely disagree with that sentiment. It is time to step up. All institutions began small. I recall when we were trying to create Africa 50 infra, the idea was quite modest. There are some things on funding infrastructure we could not do on the balance sheet of the FDB, but we could do it outside a balance sheet. And so we created this Africa 50 infra. I had the same things. There are many other infrastructure vehicles. Why do we need one? I think now, I'm proud to say that they seem to be laying roots and working together with you. So I want to say that we believe in strong international cooperation. We want very strong international organizations. Now, strong African organizations will complement, not compete with, international organizations. And at this time of massive headwinds, what we need is a paradigm shift. As they say, it is time to organize, not to agonize. So, thank you very much.
Another big round of applause, please, for Dr. Donald Kaberuka. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Kaberuka. C'est un véritable honneur que d'être en votre compagnie ce soir. Merci. Let's now proceed to our fireside chat and guiding this discussion. Well, we welcome two of Africa's most respected journalistic voices, Mr. Anwar Versi, editor of New African magazine. Welcome, Anwar. And also Mr. Omar Ben Yedder, group publisher and managing director at IC Publications. Omar, Anwar, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Can you hear me? Right, so it's a great pleasure for me and a great privilege to be invited here to run this panel. It's, as Dr. Elome has pointed out, and as we heard from the brilliant Dr. Kaberuka, we are in a fairly crucial period now with African development banks. I mean, both of them have outlined exactly what the African development banks have done, especially after the COVID crisis. And we covered these events. And the impression I got from banks like Afrexim Bank, African Development Bank, etc., but especially some of the smaller, younger, newer banks, that when African countries and sovereigns were in trouble, and some of them were in very deep trouble, they said, okay, what can we do to help? They did not start looking through the books and so on. They just wanted to see what they could do to help. But now we see that there are certain issues which have cropped up, which might be threatening their viability. So we will try to explore that as much as we possibly can. Now, I've got a very distinguished panel. First of all, I've got Omar here who's going to help me. He's my publisher, my boss, but he's also my adopted son. So he has to behave. So I was going to introduce all the panelists, but Dr. Elome has done an absolutely magnificent job. So all I will do is I will call their names and ask them to please come and take the place. So we start with Dr. Sachs, please. Join us. Dr. Lisa Saxon, perhaps you want to come in the center here? Thank you very much. Now, Professor Kako Lebukbo. You've heard some very great things about him. Professor, please come and join us. They tried to sabotage his trip by losing his luggage, but he stuck to it. And finally, Dr. Mishak Mutize. Dr. Mutize, please join us. Yeah, so I was going to start by defining what the preferred creditor status is all about, but again, Dr. Elombe has done an absolutely magnificent job. He's explained what it is. But I think that before we go too deep into it, it'd be nice to get some clear definition. Just what is this preferred creditor status or treatment? What is it? Why is it so important? And why are people struggling so hard to maintain it? Why are people trying to remove this? I mean, there's a campaign going on, let's make no two ways about it. And the man who knows the answers to all those questions is sitting right here on my left, and he's an absolute expert in this, on this. So please, Dr. Mutise, please explain to us what is going on.
Thank you very much, Amber, for this introduction. But firstly, it's my honor to be part of this very critical conversation, especially in the occasion of such great African thinkers and great African optimists who have run this race until where we are. So it is just our hope that we will be able to make the impact to that level that you have pitched so high. So the issue of the preferred creditor status, I think it's what we have been privileged in the African Union to advance and to bring to the policymakers the importance of preserving this status, because it lies really at the core of African financing ecosystem, which the distinguished speakers have outlined. But in very simple terms, the preferred creditor status is an unwritten practice which was brought by the traditional multilateral financial institutions, the World Bank, IMF, in the lending system of multilaterals. So in simple terms, we'll say these institutions are normally driven by the mandate for development. So in the practice of lending, they need to lend counter-cyclical. So in other words, they still should be able to lend even in the times of crisis, because they are not driven by profit. So also for them to continue lending, the repayments need to still continue to flow from the borrowers, even in the crisis. So in other words, they enjoy this privilege to ensure that they are still able to access capital from the borrower side and still advance on the other side in the value chain of it. So in this case now, African multilateral financial institutions, by virtue of them being established through agreements of the member states, they are entitled to this status because their founders or founding states also want them to continue bridging this financing gap, to be able to access financing through the channel of private lenders or other commercial lenders, but should be able to perform the financing to where it's needed, especially in the infrastructure sector, or projects that are not attractive for commercial lending. So that's, in short, why this has been an issue. Or maybe to put it a little further in short, is that rating agencies have been raising a lot of contention around this, using the words that PCS, or preferred creditor status, has been contested, and mainly because there are a few countries that has defaulted in Africa. So the contagion is in that the African multilateral banks don't lend concessionally enough to justify them enjoying this privilege. But in this case, African multilaterals, we can't say that it's a privilege. In other words, they have a right to enjoy preferred creditor status than other international banks.
We'll come to that later, but as a non-banker, do I understand from you that the preferred creditor status means that when you lend money to somebody and then that person gets some difficulty in paying back, which is something that I think most of us are aware of in our private lives at some stage. But when that happens, then those people who stand in the queue to get the money paid, if you enjoy preferred creditor status, you are first in line.
Absolutely.
Right. You are first in line. Now, why is this important? So, for my understanding for what you have said, the importance is that if you are a development financial institution and you lend money to a sovereign, for example, or to another entity, you expect to be first in line to be paid back. If that happens, then you get your money back and you are in a better position to help others. If you lose that privilege, then you have got real problems yourself. Have I got that right?
Absolutely.
Right. So now, Lisa Sachs, what do you say? Why are they trying to get some of the institutions to lose their preferred creditor status? We have seen just how important they are. Yeah.
First of all, let me just say how extraordinarily privileged I am to be here among my mentors and teachers from whom I'm learning. So I feel like a student on the stage. But the reason I'm here, I think, is because I'm an observer of the complete perversity of our global financial architecture and how broken it is, and how actually it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And Afreximbank and the whole African continent has disproportionately borne the brunt of that broken system. So that's what I kind of an external perspective on the system and how broken it is. The one piece I would just add to your obviously expert explanation is not only that PCS enables the financing to be returned reliably, but that knowing that the financing will be returned means that development finance institutions that traditionally, unequivocally enjoy PCS are then rated accordingly because it is considered a lower risk. You're going to be first in line, you're going to get that rating. And not only does that mean that you get the financing back, but it means that with a high rating, you're able to borrow affordably on the international markets to be able to on-lend. So it's a double benefit in a sense. It's not even a benefit, by the way. It's a double feature of development finance institutions, that you reliably get repaid and that you're able to borrow affordably. So even the suggestion of withdrawing that basic feature of development finance institutions is horrifically misguided. The only reason I could say why is because the whole system, it is part of a system that disadvantages developing countries and developing country institutions. So I can elaborate on that, but I think the only way to understand it is that the whole assessment of risk and the whole assessment of development finance institutions outside of the major development banks are consistently undermined.
Lisa, I'm going to take you up on something because Dr. Kabaruka said we need strong global cooperation. So you're saying the system is broken, but Dr. Kabaruka is saying, okay, we need our independence, financial independence and autonomy, but at the same time, we also need strong global cooperation, and actually we need the savings of outside world, so China, India, etc., to come to Africa to help finance our development. So if you're saying the system is broken, how are we going to get this strong global cooperation, especially in a world where we're seeing or new multipolarity, well, not new actually, but multipolarity and nativism?
Well, we need to fix the system. That's why I'm here. So we do need to fix the system because the basic point is that sustainable development and financing the critical infrastructure that's needed, which, by the way, is foundational to Africa's development needs, to access to energy, which is woefully still not universal in Africa, but broader development needs, building now resilience to the climate crisis that Africa didn't cause. All of that requires long-term affordable finance, public finance. Irrespective of pledges, which are, by the way, nonsense and they don't come through, irrespective of whatever the international community says about how they'll support the financing, they're not. We see that they're not. So Africa needs to be able to access long-term affordable borrowing from the international community. That's why we do need to stay connected with the rest of the system. Right now, the way that most parts of the international system assess risk is fundamentally misaligned with Africa's inherent creditworthiness, their growth prospects, including as recognized by the IMF, Africa has the highest growth rate of any other region in the world. So the way that risk is assessed is fundamentally misaligned, and it is undermining Africa's ability to borrow affordably to fund its long-term. And by the way, just one other piece, which is that the IMF that says that Africa is going to grow the fastest also tells African countries, but you can't borrow. You can't borrow. Don't invest publicly because you can't sustain the debt. So am I saying that that's an absolutely fixed, broken system? No, I'm here because we need to fix it and call it out. And I do think that there are new international partners for Africa that don't see it that way, that see the value of the partnership, that see the inherent promise in investing in Africa, and that will be allies in fixing aspects of the broken infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Just want to follow this thing through a little bit more. Is this system actually legal? From what I know, it's not a legal system. There's no legal obligation. This is a willing creditor, willing lender agreeing to it. Am I right? So in other words, the African Union has agreed.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
So it's only the African Union and the African Union countries that can decide on this, in theory at least.
Well, literally we can say that, but it's absolutely true that that decision lies with the borrower to grant that status to the lender, because they have the prerogative to exercise it. But I wanted to add one thing. I think Dr. Kaberuka has mentioned it. We were in the Moody's event today in the morning, and the Minister of Finance from Rwanda was there, and he mentioned the same thing of perception. Perception is very important in markets, and that is where we need to do a little bit more work to address the perception imbalance. Because if you question a certain component which builds up the framework of ability to access financing, it completely destabilizes the system. And it also caution investors already to exercise their ability to extend money at a certain cost. So we might be facing a difficult situation to address that in the immediate term, but it's a necessary objective to advance so that in the end, investors have a correct view of the actual risk than the perceived risk to allow capital to flow. So let me pause.
Thank you very much. I'll be coming to you, Professor, in a minute, and Omar will probably ask you the same question or slightly different version in French, because you are a wonderful French speaker. And this is a question of perception. I mean, these are linked questions. Risk perception. So all countries borrow. I mean, we know that all countries borrow, whether, internally or externally. But what becomes quite important is the rate, the interest rates. As you are bankers, you know that the rates go up and go down, depending on risk perception. Now, just to give you one example, Germany, for example, can raise a 1 billion 10-year loan, paying just 229 million interest over this period. Right? So Germany wants to borrow $1 billion over a 10-year period. They will pay 229 million in interest over this period. It's quite a lot. Zambia, on the other hand, would pay for exactly the same loan at the same term, $1.2 billion for exactly the same. In other words, they would be paying $1.2 billion more than the principal that they borrowed in the first place. So, Professor, are there any real reasons for this perception, or is it just Africa getting the short end of the stick again? Omar, do you want to?
The professor will speak in French, so if you can put your interpretation headsets.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais m'associer aux collègues pour féliciter et remercier Afreximbank et son président.
President. And we also heard a wonderful lecture from Dr. Kaberuka. And I think that with the opening remarks of the Executive Vice President and Dr. Kaberuka's remarks, we've really set the scene. And I'd like to say three things to respond to your question and to contribute to the discussion. The first thing I'd like to say is that, as my predecessors were saying, we have to continue making efforts and working on perception and work on the perception that the rest of the world has of risk in Africa. We need to really, this is to me something that is really fundamental. We need to improve this perception. Second thing, we need to continue showing that we are serious in terms of governance and make things as transparent as possible. And this leads me to the third point, which is that in our arguments, we cannot give the impression that we are prioritizing mediocrity. There is a speech behind the speech, if you will, and this could sometimes be dangerous discourse. In other words, if you don't know us Africans, and you might think that we're a more high-risk continent than other continents, but please, let us build our own, construct our own risk indicators. It's very risky to have this type of discourse. That's why I'm saying we have to really pay attention to this. And sincerely, we need to be able to manage our continent. But do we really have a good sense of it? And are the entrepreneurs really managing things well? Are we really transparent in how we are managing mining resources, for example? And are we seriously managing conflicts? I'm from West Africa, and the Sahel zone, there's a lot of difficulties. There are conflicts in the eastern part of the DRC. There are problems in Libya. We have difficulty for migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa going to the Maghreb. We know what's going on in Tunisia. So what I mean by all that is that there's a certain number of elements that might perhaps rightly so give this perception that Africa is a risky continent. And to summarize, I would say two things. The first thing, we need to give a signal to the rest of the world and tell the rest of the world that they need to have the most accurate, precise information as possible about Africa. And secondly, we need to have the courage to say that Africa is not well managed currently. At any rate, that's what I think. I think that Africa is not well managed right now. And based on that, what can we do to be better managing our continent? Thank you. Professor, I'd like to come back to you because the way I heard, or what I took away from the lecture from Dr. Babacar is that we're sometimes our worst enemy, our own worst enemy. And what I mean by that is sometimes we say we want to change the mentality, but it has to come from us. It's our leaders who have to decide whether we're going to repay the debt to this institution or to that institution. So we're the ones that are making our own decisions, and we have to defend the interest of our institutions and the international scene. But you're talking about dependence and that we're being subjected to versus a chosen independence. So what do you think we need to have financial sovereignty? And what do you think we need to do in order to get this political leadership? Because others aren't imposing this on us. Yes. When we talk about strategic financial sovereignty, let me give you an example. You can't ask permission from the financial market to build a hospital. You see what I mean? In other words, there are times when no matter what the perception is, whatever the rest of the world might think about the risk in Africa, a sovereign African state needs to be able to decide if it's going to build infrastructures or things for its citizens, no matter what happens. That's what sovereignty is. And that's why in my work, I always come back to the question of monetary sovereignty, because financing allows us to manage the risk, but it's money that helps us to manage uncertainty. And that's where this whole discourse around financing is incomplete, in my opinion, because for situations that we cannot predict, there's just money. And that is really the founding element for sovereignty. And that's why I think for 20 years I've been trying to fight against the CFA franc, because that's part of the French colonization. And I think that we don't want to assume this independence, this monetary independence. It's something you can't assume this independence unless you decide to be serious in how you manage things, because there are three things that I see are still not on my continent. We don't have a vision of our leaders, the ability to lead, and the ability to evaluate what we're doing. So until we're able to have this facility to be able to say that the rest of the world's going to keep looking at us as being a risky place, but we are not necessarily making the efforts we need to do to be able to earn this respect. And I fear that until we are able to do that, it's going to continue along the same lines. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Dr. Sachs would like to come in.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. I will not comment on the politics that I don't know in Africa. I will reserve my criticism of politics for my own country. There's plenty deserved. But what I would say, that there's some components of risk perception that are exogenous. I would ultimately completely agree with you for many reasons. This is why Africa should build its own financial institutions. That requires both leadership, but a number of other structural changes. But let me just note some aspects of risk perception that is not easily controllable by the continent. And this is primarily how risk rating agencies assess risk. The main reason that risk agencies say that Africa countries cannot assume debt, whereas developed countries, by the way, have much higher debt ratios, and that doesn't concern the rating agencies, is because developed countries have deep capital markets. They borrow in their reserve currencies. They have central banks. They have liquidity mechanisms. So that gives confidence to the rating agencies that the developed countries can manage the debt. But those are features of the international financial architecture. The fact that African borrowers have to borrow in hard currency and not in their own currency, the fact that there aren't international liquidity mechanisms to manage liquidity crises, which happens when you have to borrow expensively and short-term for long-term investments. You have liquidity crises, not solvency crises. And the rating agencies don't distinguish that, the IMF doesn't distinguish that, and there aren't liquidity mechanisms. So these perceptions of risk are functions of the financial architecture. By the way, added to that, the credit rating agencies consider poverty to be the most decisive indicator for risk, implicitly and explicitly. Credit ratings are correlated with GDP levels. They consider where you borrow from to be a consideration of risk, not how much in the terms of your borrowing, but where you borrow from. They consider data transparency and policy stability, which are basically how much African states are integrated with Western markets to be functions of risk. And then they don't recognize that their perceptions of risk are self-reinforcing, because those are structural constraints. When Africa can't meet them, they're downgraded. That makes the borrowing more expensive. It makes the liquidity a challenge, and so on. So this is not at all to negate your point for the imperative of every country, every region, and I'll start with my own, to manage its country well. But I do think that there are aspects of risk perception that are structural, and they're reinforcing structural issues. And those are the ones at least I, from outside of the continent, am determined to address.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the floor. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sachs. I just want to remind you that when we finish the panel discussion here, we'll have about 10 minutes question and answer from you. So, be ready to come up with your questions when we come to it. But there's one point that I wanted to raise with you. One of the criticisms that has been made for organizations like Afro-Exim Bank is that they've gone outside their mandate. Instead of being simply a trade bank, a trade finance bank, they're financing other things. They're giving some loans directly to countries in need. They are going into things like financing health facilities. They're going into things like financing education facilities. They're even going into things like financing entertainment. I mean, we all know that Hollywood and Bollywood are earning billions and trillions of dollars, but when it comes to Africa, trying to go along the same way to develop our own talent, then suddenly, it's too much risk. I mean, you guys can't do this. But the whole ecosystem of Africa is very different from the ecosystem in the developed world. You cannot have trade if you have no infrastructure. End of story. You cannot have intelligence trade without education. For education, we need schools. You need healthy people. You need hospitals. So if an organization like Afro-Exim Bank feels that they need to invest in these kind of facilities, what have they done wrong? And the thing is that their record is excellent. They haven't lost money. They've made profits. And even that has been used against them. Why do you make profits? If you're making profits, then you're a commercial bank. Huh? I mean, it is part of their mandate. They have to manage money. I mean, this is not their money. It's money, they do it. So it is not just the architectural system is broken. It's only broken when it comes to Africa. And I think one of the ways to do it, as Dr. Kaberuka and others have pointed out today, is that we go our own way, eventually. I mean, finance does not only come from one source. Finance can come from all sorts of sources. We have domestic financial sources, huge amounts. There are sovereign funds that can also be put into use. So I would like to get from the audience two things. One, you're also working, Dr. Mutisa is working on the Africa Credit Rating Agency, so that this agency will then make its own credit rating and it will rank companies. I don't know how far they've gone. So if you can tell us briefly about it, and then I'd like the professor to see how we can break this chain once and for all. Please.
Thank you, Amba. I think you have just summed it all, that it's all about building an ecosystem. So the issue of the rating agency that you are raising, it was a mandate that were given by finance ministers to develop an African rating agency as part of an alternative system to bring another side for investors to weigh the difference in opinions. So unfortunately, when we're given this mandate and we were trying to find ways to execute it, what we had in mind is we have so many banks in Africa that are going to support us. So unfortunately, when we realized that not many banks are willing to support that kind of adventure, it's because banks like high interest, because that's where they get their income. So going forward, we realize that there are various leverages that we can also implement to make a difference. So I'll point one very important article that we have been able to advance as one of the legitimate reasons why we need an African agency. It's because there are so many positive dimensions that investors are being deprived of when there are channels of raising money. I'll mention one example of what we're discussing today with the Moody's analyst. Senegal have managed to raise funding from the regional financial market to the tune of 5.3 billion over 9 months. The rating agency that downgraded Senegal a week ago, they write a full report that does not mention or that does not characterize this exercise in any positive light. So in other words, the raising money from a regional market is not interpreted as a strength. It's interpreted as a constraint because Senegal has been closed out of the international market. So what this is doing is cementing the negative perception that has been highlighted here. So that even a few investors that are active in this market are become more cautious or over a risk that does not exist. So it was these kind of circumstances that finance ministers believe that if there is an Africa credit rating agency, it will be able to present an alternative view and let investors weigh the information that it provides.
So in other words, an African credit rating review will give the true picture. Will
Absolutely.
give the true picture of what a country cannot do and what its potential is.
We like to
Rather than
characterize
just
it as alternative or a more accurate and comprehensive view. And we say this because there are other domestic rating agencies in Africa that the big three have been interested in. So that shows that there is some value or dimension that these rating agencies bring in the rating industry that the big three does not have.
So Anwar, I'm being told that our time is up, so we'll take 2 questions from the floor. And then
Oh,
we'll
have we
to wrap
run
it
out
up.
of time already?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I've got someone's telling me there.
We've only just started, Omar.
we'll
But
take-
okay, I
Just-
bow to you. Let's
Sorry,
take
sorry, dear
questions from the
colleagues. Just a
audience.
very quick announcement before, as you gather your questions together and be ready to participate in this Q&A, we sadly have to release Dr. Sachs now in order for you to catch your plane on time.
No.
You sure?
Yes.
All right then.
Okay, wonderful.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Good
Well
news.
done. Well done. Thank you.
So we're waiting for an African country to give the Sachs family the citizenship. I think the African Union should give you the African passport to the Sachs family.
Agreed. 100%.
Dedication, the biggest advocates of Africa outside of the continent.
Okay, anyway, Omar has overruled me. So now the floor is open to you. Please ask your questions. And I think our lovely Anne-Marie is around somewhere with the microphone.
So
I can't
there's a
see
lady-
very
there's a
clearly,
lady
but
there.
she'll come to you.
Here we have the mic.
Hello, my name is Winnie Mangeni. I work at Microsoft AI, and also I have an AI company in Kenya. And I have two questions. The first question is, Africa keeps being told to diversify in terms of lenders, and whether you go to the West or even you come here, the interest rates still favor the lender. Like, let's say if I go to a World Bank, ask for funding, for a country, 9% interest rate, right? So what strategy do you see would at least help us navigate that dependency? And then my second question is data. I'm glad that there's a credit rating being worked on, but data is a big piece, right? And there's a lot of scarcity of data. And you see that there's fintechs, and also now AI is coming in, where there's a lot of data being consumed coming from Africa, where I see, to me, that data is going to be the next form of dependency of the continent. I wanted to see from the panelists where you see in terms of protecting our data so that we don't get that dependency happening again.
Okay. Thank you. I think
So
let's take another question.
Yeah, we'll take
before-
another question, then we'll...
Another question, please. Who's got the microphone? Okay, please introduce yourself.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
Introduce yourself.
Okay.
Who was that?
We've got, there's another way.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. Just on the themes of Africa being increasingly organized and increasingly autonomous, which I would say are very laudable goals, and I would certainly encourage. A very specific question, if we could come back to the preferred creditor status, the preferred creditor treatment. I know Dr. Mashek knows, and I imagine some other people know, that this is not a kind of status that is awarded by a credit rating agency or anybody else. It's simply a fact that's either observed or not, right? And it comes down to how does the country that owes the money treat its different creditors? And essentially, does the borrower treat a multilateral institution differently from the other creditors or not, right? So this is, in effect, it's in the control of the African sovereigns, in fact, how they treat their own multilaterals. And although, in general, it has been an unwritten rule, it need not be an unwritten rule. It could be a written rule. It could be contractual. It could be something that's instituted by treaty. And I would actually argue that the most effective means of enforcing preferred creditor treatment is exactly the organization, the coordination among the multilaterals, right? Because what makes preferred creditor treatment effective for the World Bank is the fact that the IMF is not going to lend money to somebody who currently is in default to the World Bank. So it's the multilateral institutions being coordinated amongst each other that makes it work. And so my question is, for all of you, I think especially Dr. Mashek, but for all of you, do you see the willingness among African multilateral institutions to cooperate in this way, to not lend money to somebody who is not honoring preferred creditor treatment?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, we're rushing through because we don't have so much time. So
the data sovereignty.
But it's an excellent point. It's a very, very good point. So shall we?
Yeah, the data sovereignty. The professor.
Start with professor.
La souveraineté de data. Okay. Vous voulez répondre à cette question?
Do you want to answer the question about data sovereignty? No? Data sovereignty? No?
So we'll start with Dr. Sachs in terms of diversity of funding. So diversity of sources of funding.
Okay, so just 2 points. One is I want to hear what you have to say about the PCS, but let me give an external perspective on that question too, which is that it's not really an independent decision of the sovereign, because the sovereign was under a lot of pressure from its other creditors. Actually, this was really initiated by the Paris Club, telling the African sovereigns, suggesting to the African sovereigns, I don't know, you can correct me, but it was not an independent decision it didn't seem to me to be an entirely independent decision about where to force losses. And then what to me was most striking was that Fitch downgraded or moved to downgrade before there was even an action taken, which is effectively undermining the PCS before anything official happened. And of course, a downgrade has an immediate consequence on borrowing costs and so on. So just to, again, from my non-African perspective, emphasize the role of non-African actors in shaping what happens within the African context. But this goes to the other source of finance. And I just want to affirm that this is why it is so important to build a domestic capital base. It is precisely to build resilience to these external factors. It's not easy to do, by the way, especially when you have constraints on long-term borrowing, constraints on public spending, for borrowing for productive investments in infrastructure, for resilience. It's not easy to do. But that is why Afreximbank and the public development banks are so critically important, because it is the stack of financial institutions within the continent that are what translates the domestic capital that we're saying, the sovereign wealth funds and the insurance and the pension funds. That's the capital base. Then they need to be able to borrow in local currency, by the way, to avoid the currency risk, and to have project preparation and to extend the tenure of borrowing. And then Afreximbank is so critical for the liquidity and the being counter-cyclical to the borrowing. So just to say, it is in light of this external context that building the domestic capital base is, and not just the base, but the institutions to leverage and to be counter-cyclical and to support the long-term, affordable, low-cost borrowing and public investment is so critical.
The professor would like to say a few words on one.
Yeah.
Yes, I would like to follow up on what Professor Sachs was saying. I agree with Lisa, but what I would like to say is that we can't wait for the development banks. We can't expect that they're going to assume the functions or the roles of the state. I'm very clear on that. And I'll give you an example. The COVID pandemic. The central banks in the world, across the world, reacted very differently. The American Federal Reserve injected 20% of their GDP, American GDP, in order to deal with the COVID pandemic. The European Central Bank injected about 15% of the European GDP. But the African central banks only injected about 4% of the African GDP, because they don't have the margin of maneuver to be able to create currency, because if you have, with currency, you also have to have production. So I agree, and I think we could spend hours talking about the PCS, but I don't think that's not what's going to develop Africa. What's going to develop Africa is that our development banks need to stop being in politics. I was a minister in Africa. I know that there are a lot of political loans. They need to stop giving these political loans because there's a presidential election coming up. So we think we might need to build a little bridge in this village, or maybe you could build a road in this village. And so then they build the bridge, they build the road, and then they say after, yeah, but we don't have PCS. Just a moment.
ask you please to stay quiet whilst we listen to such great expertise. I will ask you please to remain quiet. Mesdames et messieurs, s'il vous plaît, je vous demande...
Again, I would ask you to please be silent because we have an opportunity to have such great experts with us. Please go ahead and continue. No, that was the end of what I was coming to the end of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to follow up on what Lisa was saying. We really, as Africans, we need to be serious in governance. The rest of the world didn't build Africa or as a continent that needs to develop itself. We all know what the history is. Africa is a continent where people come to find raw materials. And so I don't understand why we're surprised that if Africa wants to develop, it now becomes a risky continent from the point of view of the rest of the world. Okay, I mean, it's the contrary. So based on that, as you said so well, we need to build our own indicators. And just because we have a fever, we're not going to break the thermometer to resolve the fever, if you see what I'm saying. We need to establish our indicators of risk perception, and these need to be based on something that I think is fundamental, and that is having a very clear vision. We need to be able to get out of these beliefs that the rest of the world thinks this thinking that we have that the rest of the world wants to harm us. No, we need to work together to build the path for our shared prosperity. And this is through financing, yes, but it also comes through mobilizing funds, because we have to have credit, and of course, in order to develop, and it's the central banks that are going to be ensuring this credit.
Excellent note. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and but before we go completely, just wanted to point out that our Master of Ceremonies, Marianne Borges, who's done a marvelous job, is also from Cape Verde. You've heard the news about Cape Verde. So on our behalf, we would like to send our appreciation to the second smallest country ever to qualify for the World Cup finals. So well done on our behalf. But all I need to do now is just ask you to join me in appreciation for our excellent panelists. And so thank you very much, Professor. Salute to you. Ms. Sachs, thank you very much, and thank you for staying over. And Sir, Ms. Meshach, excellent, thank you for your contribution. And you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for the Blue Sharks of Cabo Verde. That's very kind of you. So we are now going to proceed to a group picture, please. Docteur, s'il vous plaît. Let's take a quick group photo. Wonderful. A big round of applause once again for our panelists and fantastic moderators. Thank you so much. And now, to bring our reflections together and close this year's lecture, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce a leader whose analytical vision continues to guide Afreximbank's economic strategy and innovation across the continent. A man known for turning data into direction and insight into impact. So please put your hands together to welcome now Dr. Yemi Kale, Afrexim Bank's Group Chief Economist and Managing Director, please.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We spent a lot of time tonight, so I'll make this very brief. It is both an honor and a profound privilege to deliver these closing remarks at the conclusion of yet another truly enlightening and inspiring edition of the Babacar Ndiaye lecture. And on behalf of the board, management, and staff of Afrexim Bank, I extend our deepest gratitude to everyone who has contributed to the success of this remarkable event. Our discussion this evening on leveraging global Africa's capital for its development has brought out several powerful and interrelated themes, each resonating deeply with the continent's current realities and future aspirations. Foremost among these is the recognition of the central role that Africa's own institutions play in shaping and sustaining its progress. We were reminded that Africa's multilateral financial institutions remain the bedrock of our economic resilience. In turbulent times, they provide countercyclical financing and the contextual expertise needed to sustain growth when global markets tighten. Therefore, strengthening and empowering these institutions means reinforcing Africa's ability to steer its own development path and safeguard its economic destiny. This year's theme is therefore both a vision and a call for Africa to seize the reins of its financial future and to design systems that reflect our own realities, our resilience, and ambitions, just as the late Dr. Babacar Ndiaye so passionately envisioned in his dream for the continent. Against this backdrop, I would like to express our deep appreciation to some of the individuals whose efforts have made this year's Babacar Ndiaye lecture yet another resounding success. Let me begin by extending our heartfelt gratitude to our incoming president, Dr. George Elombi, for his powerful and visionary opening address, one that so eloquently captured the enduring spirit of Dr. Babacar Ndiaye and so aptly set the tone for today's lecture. Dr. Elombi, to me, exemplifies a rare and admirable balance, combining an unwavering demand for excellence and integrity with an approachable, people-centered leadership style that inspires motivation and fellowship. He is in many ways a human embodiment of the carrot and stick philosophy. But in his case, for every stick, and that stick is indeed firm, there is a carrot twice as large. It is this blend of discipline and empathy that makes him such an exceptional leader. Firm but fair, disciplined but with empathy, a blend of steel and warmth, a guiding hand but with a generous heart. So we are all looking forward with great anticipation to his assumption of office as president and chairman of the board of Afrexim Bank, following the impactful and transformative leadership of Professor Benedict Orama, who unfortunately could not be with us today. And as President Orama's remarkable tenure draws to a close, we are reassured by the continuity and stability that Dr. Elombi's leadership represents. He has been deeply involved in every step of the bank has taken over the years. He has been a constant presence, working hand in hand with President Orama and his fellow other executive vice presidents, and playing an instrumental role in building the world-class institution that is celebrated today. And on behalf of the 2025 Babacar Ndiaye Lecture Planning Committee, we are also sincerely grateful to Dr. Elombi for the support and guidance he provided throughout the planning of this event, which has contributed immensely to the success we have witnessed here today. Our gratitude also goes to our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, former president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Kaberuka's insightful articulation of Africa's development journey emphasizes that amongst rising mercantilism, weakening multilateralism, and global geopolitical shifts, Africa must strengthen and federate its financial institutions, such as Afreximbank, the AfDB, and regional DFIs, into a coherent continental financial architecture capable of mobilizing domestic capital and asserting Africa's economic sovereignty and constrained capital flow. His message was both pragmatic and inspiring. He argued that Africa's transformation depends not only on capital, but on governance, ownership, and coordination to end dependency cycles and fully participate in global trade and value chains. We are sincerely grateful, sir, for your time, for your wisdom, and the enduring insights you shared with us tonight. I would also like to commend the fireside chat moderators and panelists whose contributions transformed today's session into a vibrant exchange of ideas and insights. Our moderators, Mr. Anvar Versi, Mr. Omar Ben Yeda, steered the conversation with poise and intellect, ensuring that it remained both engaging and deeply substantive. To our esteemed panelists, Professor Lisa Sachs, Professor Kaku Nabuko, and Dr. Mishek Mutize, we extend our profound appreciation. Together, their dialogue illuminated the enduring truth that Africa is not resource poor, its wealth is vast, though often underleveraged. However, by mobilizing African capital through innovative channels, we can transform idle capital into productive investments, sparking inclusive growth and job creation across the continent. Our appreciation also goes to Ms. Anne-Marie Borges, our exceptional master of ceremonies. I must confess that I did try to put her under immense pressure throughout this process, but she simply refused to be fazed. But with her characteristic professionalism, eloquence, and warmth, she guided us seamlessly through the program, ensuring that each segment flowed with clarity, precision, and energy. To our distinguished guests, partners, participating institutions, representing governments, the private sector, academia, the media, international organizations, thank you for honoring our invitation. Your presence, whether here in person or joining us virtually, reflects a shared commitment to advancing Africa's prosperity and collective progress. Last but certainly not least, I would like to express my heartfelt appreciation to the members of the BNL Planning Committee who worked with me to put this together. I thank them for their hard work, creativity, and unwavering dedication in organizing this event. Our gratitude also extends to our technical partners, Branscom, whose professionalism and seamless support ensure that every aspect of the event, from production to execution, ran flawlessly. In closing, I wish to reaffirm that the Babacar Ndiaye lecture stands as a tribute to a man who believed profoundly in Africa's potential and the power of Africans to shape their own destiny. And tonight, we have honored that legacy through our collective reaffirmation of faith in Africa's capacity to rise, to innovate, and to lead. I thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kale, for wrapping up such a fantastic evening and for your kind words. From the bottom of my African heart, I want to say muito obrigada, like we say back home, muito obrigada. Ladies and gentlemen, I also want to say muito obrigada. Thank you very much to you all for being part of such a spectacular and unforgettable evening. I just have a few quick announcements before we wrap it up. Kindly leave your headsets here on the table. Remember your gift coupons as well, because we have lovely gifts for you as you leave the room. May the spirit, ladies and gentlemen, of Dr. Babacar Ndiaye continue to guide our steps toward unity, excellence, and the unshakable faith in Africa's capacity to lead and to thrive. And as we now close this beautiful celebration, let us remember Africa's destiny will never be written for us. It will be written by us. It has been an absolute honor to be with you this evening. And as you can see, some chairs are being moved away because we're now going to proceed to 3 sets of pictures to remember this moment forever. After we are done, we'll be in the company of a band called Sweet Something. I think that's very fitting for tonight because you'll also be enjoying some delicious food and great company, of course. So let's process to the rest of our evening with renewed hope. I wish you safe travels wherever you are going back in the world, and long live Global Africa. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let's proceed to the first picture of this evening. And I now call to the stage Dr. Elombi, Mr. Denis Denya, Mrs. Kanayo Awani, and welcome back Dr. Kaberuka, please. If you could all join me on stage for one beautiful group picture, please. So if we could have ushers, please, guiding to the stage the first set of our distinguished guests, who are Dr. Elombi, Mr. Denis Denya, Mrs. Kanayo Awani, and Dr. Donald Kaberuka.
I think it's better to go that side. Because it's
sit down.
yeah. No, I don't think we're sitting down. Yeah.
Sorry, it's taking a little while.
So maybe they can stop. We'll take the pictures and they continue.
Yes, please, please. You can proceed to the center of the stage. Thank you. All right, let's proceed to a quick picture. Hang on. Wait. They're taking a picture. All right, time for the second set of picture. May I ask you to kindly remain on the stage? I now call Professor Nubukpo, please, Dr. Mutidze, Professor Sachs, to come back on the stage, as well as Dr. Kale, please. We'll have our second picture with our wonderful experts from our fireside chat. That's picture number 2. And a final one now. It's my pleasure to now call Dr. Ndiaye's daughter, as Mrs. Leila Ndiaye, and granddaughter, please come and join us on the stage for the third and final group photo of this sequence, please. Dr. Ndiaye's daughter and grandchild. And and grandson. Oh, wonderful. So grandson and granddaughter. Big round of applause for them. The new generation joining us on the stage. So inspiring. Thank you to you all. Thank you to you all, gentlemen, grandchildren, Mrs. Ndiaye, Mrs. Awani, thank you for being with us today. And this concludes the Babacar Ndiaye Lecture 2025. Bon appétit.
Look what the hot body can do. Look. Focus. Look what the hot body can do. Body be dancing. Slow wine, so my body so fine. Like wash when I'm at her inside. Too quant and I'm at her inside. Make sense, oh, make sense. Oh my God, I need resistance. Fragrance, and from my distance. Make sense, oh, make sense. Body be dancing.
Hey, yo, DJ music. Here we go.
The way we move, skin on the skin. No separation, need no competition, nah, nah, nah. On everything, it's automatic going 0 to 100.